He thought she was just a poor technician. He had no idea she was the secret billionaire genius who built his entire $2 billion empire. And when he kicked her out for his mistress, he signed his own death warrant. Hi my dear friends. Welcome back to my channel. Before we begin this beautiful story, please subscribe and turn on notifications, like this video to spread the love. Comment below what you're hoping to see. Share with someone who loves romantic stories. Please help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support helps us bring you more heartwarming tales. Now, my prayer for you: may you be blessed with long life and prosperity. May love, peace, and abundance follow you today and always. May God grant you good health, happiness, and every desire of your heart. Now, let's begin our story. Every line of code was a memorial. Every innovation was a reclamation. Every breakthrough was proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she was real. And what she was building was extraordinary. The quantum computing architecture she'd originally designed for Heron Tech had been brilliant, yes, but it had also been constrained by the company's existing infrastructure and limited vision. Now, working without those constraints, Yuna pushed the concepts to their logical extreme. She wasn't just improving artificial intelligence integration, she was fundamentally reimagining how machines could think, learn, and evolve. The platform she was creating would make quantum sync look like a calculator compared to a supercomputer. Kyungmin watched her work with something approaching awe. "You know this is going to destroy Heron Tech," he said one evening, studying the technical specifications she'd shown him. "The moment we launch this, their entire business model becomes obsolete." "I know," Yuna replied, her voice empty of emotion. And she did know. That was the point. But was it really? In the dead of night, when she couldn't code anymore and couldn't sleep yet, Yuna sometimes wondered what she was actually building toward. Revenge seemed too small a motivation for something this large. Success seemed too shallow a goal for something this profound. She told herself she was reclaiming her identity, stepping into the light, refusing to be invisible anymore. But there was something else, something she barely admitted even to herself. She was building proof. Proof that she'd existed. Proof that she'd mattered. Proof that the baby she'd lost had been conceived by someone extraordinary, someone worthy, someone real. Meanwhile, Seojin's world continued its inevitable erosion. The IT forensic team he'd hired to trace Nova's identity had hit dead ends at every turn. The anonymous innovator had used proxy servers, encrypted connections, and routing protocols that would make a CIA operative proud. Every trail led to nowhere, every lead evaporated. Nova had been a ghost, and ghosts don't leave fingerprints. But the absence left by that ghost was devastating. Heron Tech's development team, stripped of their invisible genius, struggled to produce anything remotely innovative. They could maintain existing products, could patch bugs and optimize performance, but they couldn't create. The spark that had defined the company's meteoric rise had simply vanished, and without it, Heron Tech was just another tech company competing in an oversaturated market. The board began making noise about replacing Seojin. Nothing official yet, just whispers and significant glances during meetings. His supporters were losing confidence. His critics were growing bolder. And Hyeon, rather than helping, seemed to be making things worse. IT started subtly. Her suggestions during strategy meetings were consistently wrong, though she delivered them with such confidence that people initially followed her advice. She'd recommend pursuing markets that turned out to be dead ends. She'd advocate for partnerships that collapsed within weeks. She'd position herself as an expert on innovation despite having never created anything herself. Some executives began to notice. Some started questioning her rapid rise and outsized influence. But Haejun had become too dependent on her emotional support to see clearly. She was his anchor in the chaos, the one person who never questioned him, never criticized him, never made him feel like he was failing. That she might be actively sabotaging him was unthinkable. That she might have her own agenda was impossible. Or was it? The first crack in Hyeon's facade appeared in July, during a particularly contentious board meeting. One of the senior directors, a woman named Park Ji-yoon who'd been skeptical of Hyeon from the beginning, asked a seemingly simple question. "Director Seo, You mentioned in last month's report that you'd personally developed a new client retention strategy. Can you walk us through the methodology? Hyen's smile remained perfect, but something flickered in her eyes. Of course. The strategy focuses on relationship building through targeted touchpoints and personalized engagement metrics. Yes, I read the report. But what I'm asking is how you developed the strategy. What data did you analyze? What models did you use? What was your research process? The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds too long. I consulted with our analytics team and synthesized their insights into an actionable framework. Which team members specifically? Another pause. I'd have to check my notes. Please do. I'd love to speak with them about their contribution. Jean's voice was pleasant, but her eyes were surgical. She'd drawn blood, and everyone in the room knew it. After the meeting, she cornered Seojin in the hallway with an expression that suggested she was done being diplomatic. She's lying, Jeon said bluntly. I checked with analytics. No one has worked with her on any retention strategy. She plagiarized that entire report from a Harvard Business Review article published 3 months ago. Seojin felt his stomach drop. That's impossible. Hyen wouldn't what? Wouldn't take credit for other people's work? Jeon's laugh was bitter. Wake up, Seojin. She's been doing it since she got here. Every contribution she's made has been either stolen from someone else or is so vague it's meaningless. She's a fraud, and she's using you as a shield. The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Seojin wanted to defend Hyen, wanted to reject Jeon's claims as professional jealousy or personal vendetta. But something had shifted in his perception. Some fundamental assumption had cracked, and through that crack, doubt began to seep like water through stone. That evening, Seojin did something he'd never done before. He went through Hyen's work history with forensic attention to detail. Every report, every presentation, every strategic recommendation. And what he found made his blood run cold. Jeon had been right. Half of Hyen's work was plagiarized from business publications or consulting firm reports. The other half was so generic as to be useless. In the 9 months she'd worked at Heron Tech, she hadn't contributed a single original idea. But she had contributed something else. Chaos, division, distraction. While Seojin had been focused on Hyen's needs and demands, while he'd been defending her against criticism and elevating her profile, his actual company had been falling apart. Key employees had left, important projects had been neglected, and most devastatingly, his marriage had disintegrated. For what? For a childhood friend who'd manipulated his loyalty and exploited his guilt? For someone who'd positioned herself as indispensable while actually being worse than useless? Seojin sat in his office at midnight, his head in his hands, and finally allowed himself to think the thought he'd been avoiding for months. What if Yuna had been telling the truth about the accident? What if Hyen had lied? What if everything he'd believed about that night was wrong? But if that was true, then what else was he wrong about? What else had he missed? What other truths had he been too blind or too arrogant to see? The question that haunted him now, that kept him awake in the empty penthouse he'd once shared with Yuna, was terrible in its simplicity. How long had he been building his life on lies? August brought news that would answer that question in the most devastating way possible. The announcement came through tech blogs first, then spread through the industry like wildfire. A new company called Lumina Tech was preparing to launch a revolutionary quantum computing platform that promised to fundamentally transform the relationship between artificial intelligence and human innovation. The press release was accompanied by technical specifications that made Seojin's heart stop. The architecture was familiar but evolved, like seeing a childhood home rebuilt as a cathedral. The concepts were ones he recognized but couldn't have created himself. The genius behind it was unmistakable. It was Nova's work.it had to be, but better, more refined, more ambitious. As if Nova had been holding back before and was now showing what they could really do. The launch event was scheduled for a tech conference in Seoul's convention center, a venue large enough to hold 3,000 people. Tickets sold out in 47 minutes. The tech press treated it like the second coming. Investors circled like sharks scenting blood. And Seojin Kim, watching from his slowly crumbling office at Heron Tech, felt the first stirrings of real fear. Because if Nova was working for a competitor, if that incredible mind had decided Heron Tech was no longer worth saving, then his company wasn't just in trouble. It was already dead. He just hadn't realized it yet. The night before the Lumina Tech launch, Seojin dreamed of Yuna for the first time since the divorce. In the dream, she stood in their home office, coding on her laptop, her fingers moving with the same fluid grace he remembered. He tried to see what she was writing, but the screen remained blank to him, as if her work existed in a language he couldn't read. When she finally looked up, her expression was neither angry nor sad. It was simply absent, as if she was looking through him at something far more important just beyond his shoulder. "I tried to show you," she said in the dream. "I tried so many times." He woke with her voice still echoing in his ears and a conviction crystallizing in his chest. He had to attend that launch. He had to see who Nova was. He had to know, even if the knowing destroyed him. The Seoul Convention Center buzzed with anticipatory energy as 3,000 of the tech industry's elite gathered for what had been billed as the most significant product launch of the decade. Seojin arrived alone, having left Hyun at the office with some excuse about needing to assess the competition personally. He took a seat in the back of the auditorium, anonymous in the crowd, and waited with his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The lights dimmed. The massive screens on either side of the stage illuminated with the Lumina Tech logo, a star burst of light against darkness. And then a voice, familiar and strange all at once, filled the space. 3 years ago, I built a quantum computing system that revolutionized how machines process information. I submitted it anonymously because I was afraid of being visible, afraid of taking credit, afraid of stepping into light. A figure walked onto the stage, and Seojin's world tilted on its axis, because there, bathed in spotlight and walking with confidence he'd never seen her possess, was Yuna Park, his ex-wife, the woman he'd dismissed as a capable technician, the woman he'd neglected for months, the woman who'd lost her baby because he'd been too blind to see her at all. "My name is Yuna Park," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the massive space, "and I am Nova." The auditorium erupted with gasps, with whispers, with the sound of 3,000 people suddenly recalculating everything they thought they knew. Seojin sat frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to do anything except watch his entire reality reconstruct itself around this single terrible truth. "I spent 3 years being invisible," Yuna continued, her composure absolute. "I created the innovations that built Heron Tech's success while working as an unnamed technician. I submitted my work anonymously because I believed humility was virtue, because I thought recognition was vanity, because I'd been taught that good women make themselves small." Her smile was sharp enough to cut. "I was wrong. There's a difference between humility and erasure. I learned that difference the hard way." She gestured to the screens, which filled with technical demonstrations of the Lumina platform. It was everything Seojin had feared and more, a quantum leap beyond anything Heron Tech had produced, a system so sophisticated and elegant that it made their current offerings look like toys. "This is what I can do when I stop hiding," Yuna said. "This is what I can create when I stop pretending I'm less than I am. This is who I've always been. You just weren't looking." The presentation continued for another 40 minutes, each revelation more impressive than the last. Yuna demonstrated capabilities that shouldn't have been possible, solving problems the industry had considered unsolvable, opening doors that had seemed permanently locked. She was brilliant and bold and completely, utterly unstoppable. And Seojin, sitting in the darkness at the back of the auditorium, finally understood what he'd lost. Not just a wife, not just an employee. He'd lost the foundation of everything he'd built, the genius behind every success he'd claimed, the invisible architect of his entire life. The question now wasn't whether Heron Tech would survive. It clearly wouldn't. Not against this. Not against her. The question was whether Seojin Kim would survive the knowledge of his own blindness, his own arrogance, his own catastrophic failure to see the person who'd loved him enough to make herself invisible so he could shine. After the presentation, as the auditorium emptied and industry leaders rushed to congratulate Yuna and schedule meetings with Lumina Tech, Seojin made his way backstage. He had no plan, no prepared speech, no idea what he would possibly say. He just knew he had to face her, had to acknowledge what he'd done, had to somehow bridge the infinite distance between who he thought she was and who she'd actually been all along. Security stopped him at the backstage entrance, but he insisted, and eventually someone went to fetch Yuna. She appeared 5 minutes later, still radiant from her triumph, surrounded by assistants and admirers. When she saw Seojin, something flickered across her face, not anger, not sadness, just a brief moment of something that might have been pity. She dismissed her entourage with a gesture and walked toward him. They stood facing each other in the narrow corridor, two people who'd once shared everything and now shared nothing except the wreckage of what might have been. Yuna. Her name came out broken. I didn't know. I never knew it was you. You never asked. Her voice was gentle but absolute. In 3 years, Seojin, you never once asked me what I was working on. You never looked at my projects. You never wondered why I stayed late or worked weekends. You were so convinced I was just a technician that you never considered I might be anything else. If I had known, would it have mattered? The question landed like a blade. Would you have loved me more if you'd known I was Nova? Would you have chosen me over Hyan if you'd known I was a genius? Because if that's true, then you never loved me at all. You just loved what I could do for you. Seojin had no answer because she was right. The truth of it hollowed him out. I'm sorry, he managed, for everything. For the baby, for not seeing you, for all of it. Yuna looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, very quietly, I know you are, but sorry doesn't rebuild what you destroyed. Sorry doesn't bring back our child. Sorry doesn't give me back 3 years of my life spent being invisible. She took a breath. I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Seojin. I really do. But you won't find it with me. That door is closed. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. Oh, and one more thing. You might want to look more carefully at Director Seo's role in the staircase incident. Ask the restaurant about their security footage. Ask which of your employees Hyan paid to be witnesses. Ask yourself why she'd go to such lengths to remove me from your life. And then she was gone, leaving Seojin standing alone in the corridor with the weight of implication crushing down on him like mountains. The investigation he launched that night would reveal truths that made him physically ill. Hyan had indeed orchestrated the staircase incident, had positioned herself at the top of the stairs specifically to create the situation, had paid 3 marketing employees to claim they'd seen Yuna attack her. The restaurant's security footage, which Hyan had claimed didn't exist, showed everything, showed Yuna trying to climb the stairs peacefully, showed Hyan creating the confrontation, showed the fall that was clearly an accident being transformed through lies into an assault. Hyan had destroyed his marriage deliberately, had killed his child indirectly, had manipulated his trust and exploited his guilt to position herself as indispensable. All because she'd been in love with him since childhood and convinced herself that Yuna was an obstacle to be removed. The revelation didn't make Seojin feel better. It made him feel complicit, because he'd believed her lies so easily, had trusted her manipulation so completely, had been so willing to think the worst of his own wife. The fault wasn't just Hyejin's single quote says .it was his own. In the weeks that followed, Heron Tech's stock price went into freefall. Major clients defected to Lumina Tech en masse. 3 board members resigned. Investors demanded Seojin's removal as CEO. The company he'd spent 5 years building was collapsing in real time. And this time there was no anonymous genius to save it. Hyan was fired and escorted from the building by security after the investigation's findings were made known to the board. She faced fraud charges, harassment charges, conspiracy charges. Her career was over before it had really begun. And Seojin, watching her leave in disgrace, felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just emptiness. Because winning didn't matter when you'd already lost everything that counted. The question that haunted him now, as he sat in his office watching his empire crumble, wasn't whether he'd survive this. He would probably, rich men usually did. The question was whether he'd learned anything from it, whether he'd become someone different, someone better, someone capable of actually seeing the people around him instead of just seeing what he wanted them to be. And more importantly, the question that would keep him awake for months to come, if he had one more chance, just one, to go back to the beginning and actually see Yuna for who she was, would he be brave enough to love her properly? Would he be wise enough to choose her over his pride? Would he be strong enough to build something together instead of letting her build everything alone? But there are no second chances in real life. There's only the future you create from the ruins of your past. And as Seojin Kim watched Yuna Park's star rise while his own fell, as he witnessed her building an empire that dwarfed anything he'd ever created, as he finally, belatedly, devastatingly understood exactly what he'd lost, he had to accept the hardest truth of all. Some mistakes don't get fixed. Some doors don't reopen. Some people, once invisible to you, become impossible to see again because they've already moved beyond your line of sight into a brilliance you can no longer reach. The only question left was whether he could live with that knowledge or whether it would destroy him from the inside out. 6 months after the Lumina tech launch that shattered Seojin Kim's world into irreparable fragments, Seoul's winter arrived with the kind of cold that seemed to seep into bones and memories alike, freezing everything it touched into crystalline clarity. The question that had haunted the tech industry throughout those months, would Heron Tech survive the exposure of its greatest secret, had finally been answered with devastating finality. The company that had once been valued at over $2 billion was now worth less than the real estate its headquarters occupied, and Seojin Kim, the Golden Boy CEO who'd graced magazine covers and keynote stages, had been unceremoniously removed from the empire he'd built on foundations of invisible genius. But this story, like all stories of consequence, wasn't really about the fall of one man or the rise of one woman. It was about transformation, about the cost of blindness, and about whether people could ever truly change once they'd seen themselves clearly for the first time. Yuna Park stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lumina Tech's executive suite, 43 floors above Seoul's glittering sprawl, and watched a city pulse with life below. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed not just in confidence or posture, though both had changed dramatically, but in something more fundamental. She looked solid now, real, as if she'd spent 3 years as a ghost and had finally remembered how to cast a shadow. The navy Armani suit she wore cost more than she used to make in a month at Heron Tech. The office behind her was decorated with awards and patents, all bearing her real name. The company she'd built was now valued at $3.7 billion and climbing. She should have felt triumphant. She should have felt vindicated. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, she felt hollow in a way that success couldn't fill, as if victory had revealed an emptiness she'd been too busy fighting to notice before. "You're brooding again," Kyungmin said, entering her office without knocking. He'd earned that privilege through unwavering support and genuine friendship, through being the first person who'd seen her when she was still learning how to be visible. He carried 2 cups of coffee and wore the expression of someone preparing to deliver uncomfortable truth. The board meeting went well. Everyone's excited about the European expansion. You should be celebrating, not staring out windows like you're contemplating the meaning of existence. Yuna accepted the coffee with a slight smile. Maybe I'm contemplating the meaning of existence. Is that allowed for billionaire CEOs? Only if you're planning to share your profound insights with the rest of us mere mortals. Kyungmin settled into one of the leather chairs facing her desk, his own success evident in the casual confidence of his posture. Or are you thinking about him again? The question landed softly but precisely, like a surgeon's scalpel finding exactly the right point of entry. Yuna didn't pretend to misunderstand. I saw an article this morning. Heron Tech officially filed for bankruptcy. The assets are being liquidated. Seojin's living in a small apartment in Mapogu now, working as a consultant for startups. Good, Kyungmin said without sympathy. He's lucky that's all he lost. Some of us thought he should have faced criminal charges for intellectual property theft. He didn't know it was theft. He genuinely believed the company was producing those innovations organically. Yuna heard herself defending Seojin and wondered when that impulse had returned, when the anger had cooled enough to allow for charity. His crime was blindness, not malice. And you think blindness deserves forgiveness? I think blindness is its own punishment. He has to live knowing what he missed, what he destroyed, what he could have had if he'd just bothered to look. Yuna turned away from the window, from her reflection, from the view of a city she'd conquered. That's worse than any sentence a court could impose. Kyungmin studied her with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read her silences as fluently as her words. You know what I think? I think you're not angry at him anymore. I think you've moved past rage into something more dangerous. What's that? Understanding. Maybe even pity. Kyungmin's voice was gentle but firm. And I think you need to be careful, because understanding can become a door back to people who've hurt you. You've built something extraordinary here, Yuna. Don't let nostalgia for what might have been compromise what you've actually created. The warning was well-intentioned and probably wise, but it missed the essential truth that Yuna was still struggling to articulate even to herself. She wasn't mourning Seojin or their marriage or even the life she'd lost. She was mourning the baby who'd never been born, the child who'd been caught in the crossfire of adult blindness and manipulation, the future that had died on a hospital bed while she'd been too broken to fight for it. That grief didn't care about billion-dollar valuations or industry recognition or revenge successfully executed. That grief lived in its own territory, immune to achievement, persistent as heartbeat. But she didn't say any of this to Kyungmin. Instead, she smiled and changed the subject to quarterly projections and hiring strategies, to the comfortable language of business that allowed her to be brilliant without being vulnerable. The day continued in the rhythm she'd established over the past 6 months: meetings with department heads, decisions about product development, strategic planning for international expansion. Yuna moved through it all with the competence that had always defined her, but now that competence was visible, acknowledged, compensated appropriately. She was no longer building castles for someone else to claim. She was building her own kingdom, brick by brick, algorithm by algorithm, and if that kingdom felt sometimes lonely, well, that was simply the price of sovereignty. Evening brought a charity gala at the Shilla Hotel, one of those glittering affairs where Seoul's elite gathered to write checks and network and pretend their philanthropy wasn't also calculated business strategy. Lumina Tech had been asked to sponsor a table, and Yuna had agreed because the cause supporting women in STEM education aligned perfectly with her values and her carefully cultivated public image. She dressed in a midnight blue gown that cost as much as a small car and wore her success like armor, preparing herself for an evening of small talk and performative generosity. She didn't expect to see Seojin there. Why would she? His financial situation had deteriorated to the point where charity gala tickets were surely beyond his means. But the universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony that bordered on cruelty. He stood near the bar, looking smaller than she remembered, wearing a suit that was obviously expensive but also obviously old, probably a relic from his CEO days that he'd maintained carefully because replacing it wasn't an option anymore. His hair was longer, touched with gray at the temples that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He was thinner, his jawline sharper, his eyes carrying shadows that suggested sleep was a luxury he couldn't consistently afford. He looked, Yuna thought, with a strange twist in her chest, like someone who'd been taken apart and reassembled slightly wrong, all the pieces present but the fit no longer quite right. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and for a moment the noise and movement around them seemed to fade into background static. Then someone claimed Yuna's attention, a board member from Samsung wanting to discuss a potential partnership, and when she looked back toward the bar, Seojin had vanished into the crowd like a ghost who'd never been there at all. The evening proceeded with practiced elegance. Yuna gave a short speech about the importance of mentoring young women in technology, sharing her own story in carefully edited form that emphasized perseverance without revealing pain. She wrote a check that made the event organizers smile with genuine delight. She networked and charmed and played the role of successful CEO with the skill of someone who'd learned to perform visibility as fluently as she'd once performed invisibility. But throughout it all, She was aware of Seojin's presence the way she might be aware of a distant storm, not threatening exactly, but impossible to ignore, charged with potential energy that could discharge at any moment. The discharge came during the silent auction, in a quiet corner near the displayed items where Yuna had retreated to examine a donated piece of art. She sensed his approach before she heard it, some lingering intimacy of 3 years' marriage still operational despite the divorce and devastation. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said without turning around, her voice neutral, giving nothing away. "A client gave me his ticket, said I should get out, meet people, remember there's a world beyond my current circumstances." Seojin's voice was different than she remembered, quieter, stripped of the confident resonance that had once filled boardrooms and conference halls. "I almost didn't come. Thought it might be pathetic, showing up at an event like this when everyone knows I'm what I am now." "And what are you now?" Yuna finally turned to face him, genuinely curious about how he'd answer, how he'd define himself stripped of title and wealth and illusion. Seojin met her gaze with something that might have been courage or might have been resignation. "Awake. For the first time in my life, actually awake." He gestured vaguely toward the glittering crowd around them. "I used to think I belonged here, with these people in this world. I thought success was measured in company valuations and magazine covers and the number of people who wanted something from you. But I was asleep the whole time, Yuna. Walking through my life with my eyes closed, seeing only what I wanted to see, missing everything that actually mattered." The metaphor was almost too neat, too convenient, but the exhaustion in his eyes suggested he'd earned the insight through genuine suffering rather than glib revelation. Still, Yuna kept her expression carefully neutral. She'd learned the hard way that sympathy could be weaponized, that vulnerability could be performed, that people were capable of extraordinary dishonesty, even especially when they claimed to be telling truth. "I'm glad you've gained perspective," she said, her tone suggesting the conversation was over. But Seojin, apparently, had spent 6 months rehearsing what he wanted to say and wasn't about to let the moment pass unused. "I know you don't owe me anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even 5 minutes of your time. But I need you to know that I've spent every day since that launch event understanding what I lost. Not the company, not the money, not the status." His voice cracked slightly. "You and our child. I destroyed the only things that were actually real, actually valuable, actually worth keeping." Yuna felt something shift in her chest, some carefully constructed wall developing a hairline fracture. "Seojin, I'm not asking for another chance. I'm not that delusional." He laughed without humor. "I know you've moved on. I know you've built something extraordinary. I know you're exactly where you deserve to be. I just needed you to know that I see you now. Finally, belatedly, uselessly, I see you. I understand who you were, what you did, what you gave up so I could pretend I was brilliant. And I'm sorry. I'm so desperately, inadequately sorry." The apology hung between them like smoke, sincere but insufficient, true but too late. Yuna looked at this man she'd once loved enough to make herself invisible for, this brilliant blind fool who'd needed to lose everything before he could see anything, and felt a complicated swirl of emotions she couldn't quite name. Not love that had died in a hospital room on a table streaked with blood. Not hate that had burned itself out in the fever of building Lumina Tech. Something else. Something that tasted like grief for who they might have been if circumstances had been different, if he'd been wiser, if she'd been stronger, if fate had been kinder. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, carefully. "I do, and I believe you mean it. But an apology doesn't resurrect what's dead, Seojin. It doesn't bring back our baby. It doesn't return 3 years of my life spent erasing myself. It doesn't rebuild trust once it's been completely destroyed." She paused, choosing her next words with surgical precision. "I forgive you. I do. Because carrying anger is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my energy. But forgiveness isn't reconciliation. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness is just me choosing to stop letting what you did define who I am." Seojin nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he'd expected nothing different but hoped anyway. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you. There's something else you should know." Yuna's voice softened slightly, generosity sneaking past her defenses. I've established a foundation. It supports women in tech, provides mentorship, funds education, helps brilliant people get recognition for their work instead of watching others claim it. I'm calling it the Nova Foundation. Understanding lit Seojin's eyes. That's perfect. That's exactly what should exist. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. What you did taking credit for my work, being blind to my contributions, it wasn't unique. It happens to thousands of women every day. Invisible labor, uncredited genius, systematic erasure. I could hate you specifically, or I could fix the systemic problem. I chose the latter. She held his gaze. So thank you, in a way. You taught me what needs to change. Your blindness illuminated exactly what's broken about how we value contributions and recognize brilliance. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Seojin's greatest contribution to the world might be the lesson his failure taught, the change it catalyzed, the foundation his blindness inspired. I hope it helps, he said quietly. I hope it prevents other brilliant women from having to choose between visibility and peace. It will. It already is. Yuna glanced toward the ballroom, where Kyungmin was probably looking for her, where her actual life waited with all its success and emptiness. I should go. I have a speech to give. Of course. I won't keep you. Seojin stepped back, creating physical and metaphorical distance. Take care of yourself, Yuna. Build something extraordinary. Change the world. You're finally exactly where you belong. She walked away without looking back, her heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of finality. Behind her, Seojin Kim remained in the shadow of what used to be, while she moved forward into the light she'd created for herself. It felt right. It felt necessary. It felt like the only possible ending to a story that had started with invisibility and ended with recognition. But later that night, alone in her penthouse apartment that overlooked all of Seoul like a conquered kingdom, Yuna found herself thinking about the question Kyungmin had asked earlier. Was understanding dangerous? Did seeing Seojin's genuine remorse, his authentic transformation, his real suffering create a door back to pain she'd worked hard to escape? The answer, she decided, was both yes and no. Understanding created a door, certainly, but she didn't have to walk through it. She could acknowledge his growth without participating in it. She could forgive without reconciling. She could release the anger without inviting him back into her life. That was the real power. She realized, not revenge, not success, not even recognition. The real power was choosing. Choosing who she wanted to be. Choosing who she allowed into her space. Choosing whether to let the past define her future or to build something entirely new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The weeks that followed brought changes that rippled through Seoul's tech industry like concentric circles expanding from a stone dropped in still water. Heron Tech's bankruptcy proceedings revealed the full extent of Hyun Seo's fraud and manipulation, and the legal consequences she faced became cautionary tales whispered in corporate corridors. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison for conspiracy, fraud, and filing false police reports about the staircase incident. Her fall from grace was absolute and public. A morality play about the dangers of ambition untethered from ethics. Seojin, meanwhile, quietly rebuilt a life from the fragments of his former existence. The startup consultancy he'd joined was small but respected, founded by former entrepreneurs who believed in second chances and redemption through honest work. He helped young founders avoid the mistakes he'd made, taught them about the importance of recognizing contributions and building genuine partnerships. He was good at it. Apparently, word spread that Kim Seojin, fallen king of tech, had wisdom purchased through catastrophic failure and was willing to share it for modest fees and humble circumstances. Yuna heard these updates through the industry gossip that reached even her elevated position, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Not for reconciliation, that ship had sailed and sunk, but for the possibility of transformation, for the idea that people could learn from their mistakes and become better versions of themselves. If Seojin could change, could truly see differently after being blind for so long, then perhaps others could too. Perhaps the systems that had erased her and thousands of women like her could also evolve, could also learn, could also choose differently. That hope became the driving force behind the Nova Foundation's expansion. Yuna poured energy and resources into creating mentorship programs, funding scholarships, establishing recognition awards specifically for invisible contributors whose brilliance had been systematically ignored. She gave speeches at universities where she told her story unedited, including the painful parts, the invisible years, the pregnancy lost to someone else's blindness and manipulation. The response was overwhelming. Women reached out by the hundreds, then thousands, sharing their own stories of invisible labor and uncredited genius. They'd designed products their bosses claimed credit for. They'd solved problems their companies attributed to team efforts rather than individual brilliance. They'd made themselves small so others could be large, and they were tired of disappearing. The Nova Foundation became a movement, a recognition that the story wasn't just Yuna's but belonged to anyone who'd ever been systematically erased. And in building this movement, in creating something larger than personal revenge or individual success, Yuna found the purpose that achievement alone couldn't provide. She also found, unexpectedly, something like peace. 5 months after the charity gala encounter, Yuna received an envelope delivered to Lumina Tech's headquarters by courier. Inside was a letter written in handwriting she recognized immediately, despite not having seen it in almost a year. Seojin's penmanship was distinctive, precise, and slightly formal, like the man himself had been before everything fell apart. The letter was brief. Maintain full character consistency throughout. Yuna, I'm writing to let you know I've done something I should have done years ago. I've given testimony to the tech press about Nova's real identity and contributions to hair and tech. I've provided documentation proving that every major innovation the company produced during my tenure came from your submissions. I've made clear, unambiguously and publicly, that I built my career on your invisible genius. The article will publish next week. I'm not telling you this to seek approval or forgiveness. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that the record will finally be accurate, that history will reflect truth rather than the lies I believed and perpetuated. I know this doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't return what was lost. But it's the only thing I can do to honor who you actually were and what you actually did. I hope you continue building extraordinary things. The world is better with your light in it. Seojin Yuna read the letter 3 times, feeling emotions cascade through her in waves: surprise, vindication, sadness, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name. He was right that it didn't fix anything. The past remained broken, the loss is irretrievable. But there was something meaningful about truth being told, about the record being corrected, about invisible contributions finally being acknowledged by the person who'd benefited from them most. The article published the following Tuesday. It was titled "The Genius Behind the Curtain: How Hair and Tech Built an Empire on Anonymous Innovation," and it was devastating in its honesty. Seojin held nothing back: his blindness, his arrogance, his failure to recognize his own wife's brilliance, the systematic way he'd taken credit for work he hadn't done. He provided technical documentation, submission timestamps, code samples that proved definitively that Nova and Yuna Park were the same person and that Hair and Tech's success had been built entirely on her invisible genius. The tech industry exploded with commentary. Some praised Seojin's honesty and willingness to face his failures publicly. Others condemned him for taking so long to tell the truth, for profiting from theft even if that theft had been inadvertent. Debate raged about intellectual property, about corporate ethics, about the systematic ways women's contributions were erased and men's were amplified. But through it all, one truth emerged crystal clear. Yuna Park was Nova. She always had been. And her genius was no longer invisible, no longer deniable, no longer subject to anyone else's interpretation or claim. Kyungmin found Yuna in her office that afternoon, staring at her laptop screen where the article remained open like a window into an alternate past. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his concern genuine and unconditional. "Strange," Yuna admitted. "I thought I'd feel vindicated or triumphant. Like this was what I'd been fighting for all along: recognition, acknowledgement, truth. But instead I just feel tired. Like I've been running a race for years and finally crossed the finish line only to discover there's no prize waiting, just the knowledge that I ran. Maybe that's what closure actually feels like, Hyungmin suggested. Not triumphant. Just finished. The word resonated in Yuna's chest like a bell being struck. Finished, yes. That was exactly right. The story that had started with invisibility, that had continued through betrayal and loss and resurrection, was finally, actually, genuinely finished. Not because she defeated Seojin or destroyed Heron Tech or achieved some perfect revenge, but because the truth was told, the record was corrected, and there was nothing left to fight about. She could finally, fully, completely move forward. The months that followed brought the kind of success that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Lumina Tech announced partnerships with 3 Fortune 500 companies. The European expansion launched flawlessly, with offices in London, Berlin, and Stockholm. Yuna was featured on the cover of Time Asia with the headline, "The Invisible Genius Who Changed Everything." She gave a TED Talk that went viral, viewed 20 million times in 3 months, about the cost of invisibility and the power of recognition. And through it all, she built not just a company, but a life. She developed friendships with people who saw her clearly and valued her appropriately. She traveled to places she'd always wanted to visit but never had time for. She took up painting as a hobby and discovered she was terrible at it but enjoyed it anyway. She dated occasionally, though nothing serious developed, and she was okay with that. She learned that wholeness didn't require partnership, that completeness didn't demand romance, that she could be entirely sufficient unto herself. The Nova Foundation grew into a global organization, providing support and recognition to invisible contributors across industries. They established an annual award ceremony, the Nova Prize, that specifically honored people whose contributions had been systematically overlooked or erased. The first ceremony was attended by over 1,000 people and featured speeches from women who'd spent decades being invisible before finally receiving acknowledgement for their genius. Yuna watched from the stage as these women told their stories, saw herself reflected in their experiences, and understood that her suffering had purpose. Not because suffering itself was valuable, it wasn't, but because she'd transformed it into something useful, something that prevented others from having to endure what she'd endured. That transformation was her real victory. Not defeating Seojin, not building a billion-dollar company, not even getting recognition for her innovations. Her victory was taking the pain and making it productive, taking the erasure and making it visible, taking the injustice and making it catalyst for change. And perhaps in doing that, she'd become someone even more impressive than Nova had been. Not because she was more brilliant, though Lumina Tech's innovations suggested her genius had only intensified, but because she'd learned to be brilliant and visible simultaneously, to create without disappearing, to shine without apologizing for the light. A year after the article published, Yuna received one final communication from Seojin. It wasn't a letter this time, but a small package delivered to her office. Inside was something she'd forgotten existed. A photograph from their wedding day. It showed them standing in the small ceremony venue, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder, both of them smiling with the kind of hope that only exists before life teaches you how complicated happiness actually is. Attached was a brief note. "I found this while packing up the last boxes from our old apartment. I thought you might want it, not because of what we were, but because of what you survived. You were always extraordinary, Yuna. I'm sorry it took devastation for me to see it. I'm sorry you had to become invisible so I could feel visible. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough or wise enough or humble enough to love you the way you deserved. I'm working on being better. Not for you, I understand that ship has sailed, but for the next person who trusts me, the next relationship I build, the next time someone makes themselves vulnerable in my presence. You taught me, through loss and consequences and the absence where you used to be, what it means to actually see people. Thank you for that lesson, even though you didn't know me the teaching. I hope life gives you everything I failed to." Seojin. Yuna held the photograph for a long time, studying the faces of these two people who no longer existed, him before his awakening, her before her transformation. They looked happy in the image, But it was a happiness built on unstable foundations, on assumptions that would prove false, on a dynamic that couldn't sustain itself once tested by reality. She could have felt sad looking at it, mourning what might have been. She could have felt angry, remembering what had been taken. Instead, she felt something unexpected: gratitude. Not for the pain itself, never that, but for what she'd built from the ruins of what had been destroyed. She'd become Nova again, but this time the name meant something different. Not a pseudonym for invisibility, but a symbol for transformation. Novas, after all, were exploding stars, the violent death of one thing creating the brilliant birth of something new. She died in that hospital room, in some fundamental way. The invisible wife, the erased genius, the woman who'd made herself small, that person had ended. And from that ending, this new version had been born. Successful, yes. Recognized, certainly. But more than that, authentic. Whole. Entirely. Unapologetically herself. Yuna placed a photograph in her desk drawer, neither displaying it nor destroying it. It was history now. Neither good nor bad, but simply true. And she had more important things to focus on than the past. The present called to her with opportunities and challenges and the daily work of building something that mattered. The future stretched ahead with possibilities she'd earned through suffering and work and refusing to stay invisible even when visibility was terrifying. And in the end, wasn't that the real story? Not revenge executed or love betrayed or genius finally recognized, but transformation chosen, power reclaimed, and a woman deciding that she deserved to be seen and then making herself impossible to ignore. Yuna Park closed her laptop, turned away from her window overlooking conquered Seoul, and walked toward her next meeting with the confidence of someone who'd finally learned the most important lesson of all, that visibility wasn't a gift someone else gave you, but a choice you made for yourself. Again and again and again, until the world had no choice but to acknowledge you were always there. The genius was never really in the shadows. The shadows were just in the eyes of people who refused to look. And now, finally, belatedly, inevitably, everyone was looking. So here's what I want to know from you, and I need you to really think about this. Have you ever made yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger? Have you ever hidden your brilliance because you were afraid of outshining people you loved? Have you ever given credit for your work to someone else, thinking that humility meant erasure, that being good meant being invisible? Because here's what Yuna's story teaches us. There's a difference between humility and disappearing. There's a difference between supporting someone and erasing yourself. And there's a difference between love and sacrifice that destroys who you are. I want you to comment below and tell me, what's the thing you've been hiding? What's the talent, the achievement, the brilliance you've been keeping invisible because you were afraid of what visibility might cost? Write it down. Say it out loud. Make it real. Because the first step to being seen is deciding you deserve to be seen. The first step to recognition is recognizing yourself. And if you're someone who's been blind like Seojin was, if you've been taking credit, consciously or unconsciously, for work you didn't do, for genius that wasn't yours, ask yourself, who have I been erasing? Whose contributions have I failed to acknowledge? Whose light have I dimmed so mine could shine brighter? Comment below with your truth. And then, this is important, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been invisible. Someone who's been erased. Someone who deserves recognition they're not getting. Because stories only change the world when we stop just consuming them and start applying them. When we stop being entertained and start being transformed. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about people who transform pain into power, who refuse to stay invisible, who built empires from the ruins of what was destroyed. And turn on notifications, because next week, we're telling the story of another invisible genius, this time. A man who discovered his entire company was being run by his assistant, who turned out to be the real CEO all along. But for now, I want your comments. I want your truth. I want you to stop being invisible, even if it's just in a YouTube comment section, even if it's just saying I was here. I mattered. I refuse to disappear anymore. Tell me, what's your Nova moment going to be? When are you going to step into the light and let the world see what you can actually do? The story's over, but your transformation is just beginning. Don't waste it.